October 15th, 1943. The frost-covered hills outside Leningrad stretched endlessly under a pale morning sky, where visibility reached nearly 2 kilometers across the open terrain. Senior Lieutenant Katerina Volkov crouched behind a fallen birch tree, her breath forming small clouds in the -12-degree air as she adjusted the worn wooden stock of what appeared to be nothing more than a hunting rifle. The other snipers in her unit had spent the morning questioning her sanity, wondering how anyone could expect to accomplish anything meaningful with such an inadequate weapon, when the German positions lay entrenched just 800 meters ahead. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them understood was that Katerina's seemingly insignificant .22 caliber rifle would soon demonstrate that the quietest whisper could prove far more devastating than the loudest roar, transforming their entire understanding of what made a weapon truly dangerous. The morning briefing had been particularly brutal. Major Dmitry Kozlov, commanding the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, had outlined their impossible situation with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing a terminal diagnosis. The German forces had established a heavily fortified observation post on Hill 212, a strategic position that provided them with complete visual control over the supply route connecting Leningrad to the advancing Soviet forces. Every convoy attempting to traverse the valley below had been systematically picked apart by coordinated artillery strikes, each one guided by the spotters positioned in that elevated bunker. Traditional assault tactics had already failed spectacularly. 3 separate infantry attacks had resulted in over 200 casualties without gaining a single meter of ground. The German defensive positions were simply too well designed, too heavily reinforced, and too strategically positioned to be overcome through conventional means. The bunker itself was constructed from reinforced concrete nearly 2 meters thick, surrounded by multiple layers of barbed wire, anti-personnel mines and interlocking fields of fire from supporting machine gun nests. Senior Sergeant Viktor Petrov, armed with his standard-issue Mosin Nagant rifle, had volunteered for the 1st Sniper Reconnaissance mission. His weapon, chambered in 7.62 by 54 mm rounds, represented the pinnacle of Soviet marksmanship capability. The massive cartridges could penetrate steel plate at distances exceeding 1 kilometer, and Viktor himself had confirmed over 30 successful eliminations during the siege. When he examined Katerina's rifle through his field glasses, his expression shifted from curiosity to outright disbelief. "You cannot be serious about taking that toy into combat," Viktor said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived 18 months of continuous warfare. "That caliber is what farmers use to control rabbits in their vegetable gardens. The German positions are reinforced with steel plating and concrete barriers. Your bullets will bounce off their equipment like raindrops." Corporal Alexei Volkov, no relation to Katerina despite sharing her surname, nodded in agreement while cleaning his own rifle. His weapon was a captured German Karabiner 98, a precision instrument that fired 8mm Mauser rounds capable of penetrating body armor at extended ranges. The briefing documents indicate that the German spotters are wearing steel helmets and reinforced chest protection, Alexei observed methodically. "Even if you achieve perfect shot placement, your ammunition lacks sufficient energy to penetrate their defensive equipment." Katerina listened to their technical analysis without interruption, understanding that their skepticism was based on sound tactical reasoning. From a purely ballistic perspective, her .22 caliber rifle was indeed inadequate for engaging hardened military targets. The tiny bullets weighed less than 3 grams each and traveled at velocities barely exceeding 300 meters per second. In comparison, the standard military rounds used by her colleagues weighed 15 grams and achieved velocities approaching 800 meters per second, delivering nearly 10 times more kinetic energy upon impact. But Katerina possessed information that her fellow snipers had not considered. During her civilian life before the conflict, she had worked as a precision machinist in a factory that manufactured optical instruments for scientific research. Her technical background had taught her that solving complex problems often required abandoning conventional approaches in favor of innovative thinking. The challenge was not necessarily about delivering maximum force to the target, but rather about identifying the most vulnerable point in the enemy system and exploiting it with surgical precision. The German observation post represented a sophisticated piece of military engineering, but like all complex systems, it contained inherent weaknesses that could be exploited by someone with sufficient knowledge and patience. The spotters relied entirely on their optical equipment to coordinate artillery strikes, using high-powered telescopes and range-finding instruments that required precise calibration and careful maintenance. These delicate mechanisms were protected by armored housing, but they still required clear glass lenses to function effectively. Katharina had spent 3 days studying the German position through her own modest telescope, documenting the placement and orientation of their optical equipment. The primary observation scope was mounted on a rotating platform that allowed the operators to scan the entire valley systematically. The lens housing was protected by a steel shroud, but the actual glass surface remained exposed during operational periods. More importantly, she had noticed that the German spotters followed a predictable routine, conducting their surveillance sweeps at regular intervals throughout the daylight hours. The key insight that her colleagues had missed was that destroying the optical equipment would be far more effective than attempting to eliminate the individual soldiers operating it. The Germans could easily replace personnel, but replacing precision optical instruments in a forward combat position would require days or even weeks of logistical coordination. Without their observation capability, the entire defensive position would become strategically irrelevant, regardless of how many soldiers remained alive inside the bunker. Her .22 caliber rifle possessed one crucial advantage that the more powerful weapons lacked: complete acoustic stealth. The tiny cartridges produced virtually no muzzle flash and generated sound levels barely above ambient noise. From 800 meters away, her shots would be completely undetectable to the German defenders, allowing her to conduct multiple precision strikes without revealing her position or alerting them to the ongoing attack. The morning of October 16th dawned clear and cold, with wind speeds measuring less than 5 kilometers per hour across the target area. Katharina had positioned herself in a carefully constructed hide site, approximately 750 meters from the German bunker, where the natural terrain provided both concealment and a clear line of sight to the observation equipment. She had spent over an hour adjusting her position to account for the subtle variations in wind direction and the gradually changing angle of the morning sunlight. Through her modest 4-power telescope sight, she could clearly observe the German spotters beginning their daily routine. The primary observer was a tall, methodical soldier who appeared to be in his 30s, wearing the distinctive field grey uniform of a Wehrmacht reconnaissance specialist. His movements were precise and professional as he adjusted the elevation and azimuth controls of the observation scope, systematically scanning different sectors of the valley below. Katharina had calculated that the glass lens of the German telescope measured approximately 8 centimeters in diameter, presenting a target roughly the size of a small teacup at her current range. For a conventional military sniper, such a target would be virtually impossible to engage with any reliability, especially given the need for multiple successive hits to completely disable the equipment. But her tiny .22 caliber bullets would travel in nearly perfect ballistic trajectories, unaffected by wind drift or atmospheric disturbance that would deflect larger projectiles. Her first shot was taken at precisely 7:45 in the morning, just as the German observer began his systematic sweep of the eastern approach routes. Katharina controlled her breathing carefully, allowing her heart rate to settle before applying gentle pressure to the trigger. The rifle produced only a soft clicking sound as the firing pin struck the cartridge, followed by the barely audible whisper of the bullet traveling downrange. The effect was immediate and devastating. The precisely aimed bullet struck the center of the telescope lens, creating a spider web pattern of cracks that completely obscured the optical surface. The German observer stepped back from his equipment, clearly confused by the sudden malfunction. He spent several minutes attempting to clean and adjust the instrument, apparently assuming that the damage was caused by some kind of environmental factor rather than enemy action. Katharina waited patiently for 20 minutes before taking her second shot, this time targeting a secondary range-finding instrument mounted on the left side of the observation platform. The small bullet struck the prism housing with perfect accuracy, shattering the internal optical elements and rendering the device completely inoperative. The German spotters began to demonstrate increasing levels of concern, examining their equipment more carefully and engaging in animated discussions about the mysterious failures. By noon, Katharina had systematically disabled 7 separate pieces of optical equipment using only 9 carefully placed shots. Each strike was planned and executed with the precision of a surgical procedure, targeting the most vulnerable components of each instrument to achieve maximum damage with minimal ammunition expenditure. The German observation post had been transformed from a sophisticated intelligence-gathering platform into a blind fortress, completely unable to fulfill its strategic mission. The psychological impact on the German defenders was perhaps even more significant than the tactical effects. They had no understanding of what was causing their equipment to fail so systematically. The damage patterns were inconsistent with artillery bombardment, aircraft strafing, or conventional sniper fire. The mysterious nature of the attacks created a sense of uncertainty and paranoia that began to affect their overall operational effectiveness. Senior Sergeant Petrov observed the results of Katharina's work through his own telescope, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement as he watched the German spotters struggling with their disabled equipment. "This is absolutely extraordinary," he said quietly. "They have no idea what is happening to them. Look how they keep examining each instrument, trying to understand why everything is failing simultaneously." Corporal Volkov had been tracking the German response patterns through his field glasses, noting the increasing frequency of radio communications and the obvious confusion among the enemy personnel. "They are requesting technical support from their headquarters," he reported. "The radio operator has been transmitting continuously for the past 30 minutes, apparently describing equipment malfunctions that their superiors cannot explain." The German garrison commander, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, had indeed been struggling to comprehend the situation developing at his observation post. His daily reports typically contained detailed intelligence about Soviet troop movements, convoy schedules, and artillery positions. Today, however, his communications consisted entirely of requests for replacement optical equipment and technical specialists to diagnose the mysterious equipment failures. "Every single precision instrument has suffered simultaneous malfunction," Weber transmitted to his divisional headquarters. "The damage patterns are inconsistent with known enemy capabilities. Request immediate dispatch of optical repair specialists and replacement equipment inventory." The response from higher headquarters was predictably bureaucratic and unhelpful. Replacement optical instruments were classified as strategic materials, requiring formal requisition procedures that could take weeks to process. Technical specialists were in critically short supply across the entire front, with priority given to repairing damaged tank fire control systems and aircraft navigation equipment. Meanwhile, Katharina continued her methodical campaign of optical destruction throughout the afternoon. She had identified several backup instruments that the Germans attempted to deploy as replacements for their primary systems. Each new piece of equipment was systematically disabled within minutes of being brought into operational status. The German defenders found themselves trapped in a cycle of futile equipment replacement, never able to restore their observation capability for more than a few minutes at a time. By evening, the strategic situation in the valley had been completely transformed. Soviet supply convoys began moving freely along the previously interdicted route. No longer threatened by coordinated artillery strikes from the observation post, the German defenders could hear the vehicles passing below their position, but remained completely unable to provide targeting information to their artillery units. The true genius of Katharina's approach became apparent over the following days. Traditional military doctrine would have required a major assault involving hundreds of soldiers, extensive artillery preparation, and significant casualties to neutralize the German position. Instead, a single sniper with an unconventional weapon had achieved the same strategic objective using fewer than 20 bullets and without alerting the enemy to the nature of the threat. Major Kozlov reviewed the intelligence reports from the valley with growing amazement. "The German artillery requests for fire missions have decreased by over 90% since yesterday morning," he noted during the evening briefing. "They are essentially operating blind now, unable to coordinate effective indirect fire support. The broader implications of Katarina's success began to resonate throughout the Soviet command structure. Intelligence officers started analyzing similar German positions, identifying opportunities to replicate her tactics on a larger scale. The concept of targeting enemy observation capability rather than personnel represented a significant tactical innovation that could be applied across multiple sectors of the front. Viktor Petrov approached Katarina after the evening briefing with a newfound respect for her unconventional methods. "I must apologize for my earlier dismissive comments," he said sincerely. "Your approach has taught me that effective tactics are not always about raw firepower. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution is also the most elegant one." Katarina cleaned her modest rifle carefully, preparing for another day of precision work. The German position remained occupied by enemy personnel, but they had been effectively neutralized as a strategic threat. More importantly, her success had demonstrated that innovative thinking could overcome seemingly impossible tactical challenges, even when working with limited resources and unconventional equipment. The intelligence reports from German headquarters painted a picture of growing frustration and confusion. Hauptmann Weber had been relieved of command after failing to maintain operational readiness at his observation post. His replacement, Oberleutnant Klaus Möller, arrived with a convoy of replacement optical equipment and explicit orders to restore the position's reconnaissance capability immediately. Müller's technical background as a former optical engineer gave him insights that his predecessor had lacked. After examining the damaged equipment carefully, he began to suspect that the failures were not random malfunctions, but rather the result of systematic sabotage or attack. The damage patterns were too precise and too consistent to be explained by environmental factors or equipment deterioration. "Someone is deliberately targeting our observation instruments," Möller reported to his superiors. "The damage is focused exclusively on optical surfaces and precision mechanisms. This suggests an enemy capability that we have not previously encountered." His analysis was accurate, but ultimately irrelevant. Even with his technical knowledge and additional resources, Müller remained vulnerable to the same tactics that had neutralized his predecessor. Katarina simply waited for the new equipment to be installed and then systematically disabled each piece using her proven methods. The psychological pressure on the German defenders continued to intensify as days passed without any improvement in their situation. They could see Soviet supply columns moving freely through the valley below, but remained powerless to respond effectively. The sense of futility and helplessness began to affect their morale and operational discipline. Obergefreiter Hans Richter, one of the spotters assigned to the observation post, confided his concerns to his commanding officer. "Sir, the men are beginning to believe that this position is cursed," he reported nervously. "Every piece of equipment fails within hours of being deployed. Some of the soldiers are talking about requesting transfers to other units." The superstitious fears of the enlisted personnel reflected a broader problem with the German position. Military effectiveness depends heavily on confidence and morale, particularly in isolated forward positions. When soldiers begin to doubt their equipment and their mission, their combat performance deteriorates rapidly, regardless of their training and experience. Katarina observed these psychological effects through her telescope, noting the increasingly erratic behavior of the German personnel. They had begun conducting frequent equipment inspections, constantly adjusting and readjusting their instruments in futile attempts to maintain operational status. The constant stress of equipment failures had transformed a professional military unit into a collection of anxious individuals focused more on troubleshooting than on their primary mission. 3 weeks after the beginning of her campaign, Katarina achieved her most significant success. The German command had deployed their most advanced optical equipment to the observation post, including a sophisticated stereoscopic rangefinder that represented the pinnacle of their optical technology. The instrument had cost more than 10,000 Reichsmarks to manufacture and required specially trained operators to achieve its maximum effectiveness. Katarina disabled the complex instrument with a single perfectly placed shot, shattering the primary prism assembly and rendering the entire system inoperative. The German reaction was immediate and dramatic. Radio communications from the observation post increased dramatically as the defenders reported the loss of their most valuable piece of equipment. The strategic impact of this success extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German optical instruments were manufactured in specialized facilities that were already operating at maximum capacity to support the broader conflict effort. Replacing a single advanced rangefinder required diverting resources from other critical military programs, creating ripple effects throughout their logistics system. Senior Lieutenant Katerina Volkov had achieved something that conventional military tactics could never have accomplished. Using nothing more than patience, precision, and unconventional thinking, she had transformed an impregnable enemy stronghold into a strategic liability. The German observation post remained physically intact and fully manned, but it had been rendered completely ineffective for its intended purpose. The lessons learned from her success began to influence Soviet tactical doctrine across multiple fronts. Training programs were developed to teach other snipers the principles of precision equipment targeting, emphasizing the importance of identifying and exploiting systemic vulnerabilities rather than simply engaging enemy personnel. Major Kozlov submitted a detailed report to higher headquarters describing Katerina's innovative tactics and their strategic implications. This operation demonstrates that asymmetric approaches can achieve decisive results against seemingly superior enemy positions. He wrote, "The key insight is to identify the most critical component of the enemy system and attack it at its most vulnerable point." The broader military establishment initially responded with skepticism similar to that shown by Katerina's immediate colleagues. Traditional military thinking emphasized firepower and aggressive assault tactics, making it difficult for senior commanders to appreciate the subtlety and effectiveness of her approach. However, the undeniable strategic results eventually overcame institutional resistance to change. Within 6 months, specialized sniper units equipped with precision small-caliber weapons had been deployed to multiple sectors of the front. These teams focused specifically on disabling enemy observation and communication equipment rather than engaging personnel directly. The cumulative effect of these operations significantly degraded German intelligence gathering capability across the entire theater of operations. Katerina's personal weapon, the modest .22 caliber rifle that had been dismissed as inadequate by her colleagues, was carefully preserved and studied by Soviet weapons engineers. They were particularly interested in understanding how such a small cartridge could achieve such precise ballistic performance at extended ranges. Their analysis led to improvements in ammunition manufacturing and rifle design that benefited the entire Soviet sniper program. The German military eventually developed countermeasures against optical targeting tactics, including armored lens covers and redundant backup systems. However, these defensive improvements required significant resources and time to implement, during which period the Soviet forces maintained a crucial intelligence advantage in many sectors of the front. Years later, military historians would recognize Katerina's campaign as a perfect example of how innovation and creative thinking could overcome traditional military advantages. Her success demonstrated that the most effective weapons were not always the most powerful ones, but rather the ones used most intelligently and precisely. The German observation post on Hill 212 was eventually abandoned in December 1943, as Soviet forces advanced and the strategic situation changed. When Soviet troops finally occupied the position, they discovered dozens of damaged optical instruments scattered throughout the bunker, testament to the effectiveness of Katerina's unconventional campaign. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.